Before the White House, Who Nancy Reagan Was. To understand what happened inside Nancy Reagan's family, it is necessary to begin long before the White House, long before the state dinners, the campaign trails, and the carefully managed public image that later defined her. The woman the world came to know as Nancy Reagan did not begin as a symbol of elegance or political devotion. She began as a child who experienced uncertainty early, and that uncertainty seems to have shaped much of what came after. Nancy Reagan was born Anne Frances Robbins in New York City on July 6, 1921. Her early life was not marked by the stability that people often associate with the world she later inhabited. Her parents separated when she was still very young, and for a period of years, her mother, Edith Luckett, who was trying to build a career as an actress, left Nancy in the care of relatives in Maryland. It was, by any measure, a formative experience. Nancy would later speak of those years with an honesty that revealed how deeply they affected her. She remembered waiting for her mother, living in a state of expectation, always hoping for a return that did not come quickly enough. It was the kind of childhood loneliness that does not simply disappear when circumstances improve. It settles quietly into a person and begins shaping the way they understand love, attachment, and security. Eventually, Edith Luckett remarried. Her new husband was Loyal Davis, a wealthy and respected neurosurgeon. As a teenager, Nancy was adopted by him and took his surname, becoming Nancy Davis. In many practical ways, this seemed to provide the stability that had been missing in her early life. She now belonged to a more secure household and had the kind of material and emotional structure that had once felt uncertain. Yet stability, once delayed, does not always erase the habits of feeling formed in childhood. There is a strong sense, when one looks at Nancy Reagan's later life, that affection for her was never something simple or freely assumed. It was something she may have felt had to be earned, protected, and constantly proven. She went on to study drama at Smith College, an education that placed her within an ambitious and cultivated world. After college, she entered Hollywood and tried to build a career as an actress. She was not among the biggest stars of her era, but she worked steadily, and that alone gave her a place in an industry built on visibility, charm, and careful self-presentation. Hollywood also sharpened certain instincts that would remain with her for the rest of her life: the importance of appearance, the fragility of reputation, and the value of knowing exactly how a person should be seen. The decisive turning point came in 1949. At a dinner party, Nancy Davis was seated next to Ronald Reagan, who at the time was president of the Screen Actors Guild. Their connection would alter the course of her life. They married in 1952, and from that moment onward, Nancy increasingly organized herself around Ronald Reagan's world, Ronald Reagan's needs, and Ronald Reagan's future. Later, she would say something revealing, that her life really began when she married him. It is a sentence that says as much about her devotion as it does about her sense of identity. Ronald's path became her path, his schedule, his battles, his ambitions, first in California politics and later on the national stage, became the structure around which she arranged her own existence. This devotion was not casual, nor was it decorative. It was total. Nancy Reagan did not stand beside her husband in a merely ceremonial way. She protected him with unusual intensity. His critics became, in her eyes, threats to something deeply personal. His advancement mattered not simply because she was his wife, but because his success and security had become bound up with her own emotional world. He had become, in a sense, the center around which the rest of her life revolved. There is an important detail from those early Hollywood years that helps explain the depth of that bond. At one point, Nancy's name briefly appeared on a Hollywood blacklist of suspected communist sympathizers. a serious and potentially damaging matter in that political climate. Troubled by the accusation, she reached out to Ronald Reagan for help. He assisted her, and the problem was resolved. Some biographers have suggested that this moment mattered more than it may appear on the surface. It was not merely that Ronald helped her professionally, it was that he stepped in at a moment when she felt exposed and vulnerable. If Nancy had learned in childhood that security could vanish, then this kind of protection may have carried enormous emotional force. It is possible that from that point onward, her trust in him settled into something unusually firm. Whether or not that single episode explains the full intensity of her later loyalty, it remains telling. Nancy Reagan's attachment to Ronald Reagan was not only romantic, it was also rooted in gratitude, dependence, and a deep sense that he had become the person around whom safety could be built. She did not simply love him. She believed in preserving him, defending him, and standing between him and harm. That pattern would shape the entire household that her children later grew up in. It would affect what was given, what was withheld, and who seemed to matter most within the family structure. Because if Ronald Reagan became the emotional center of Nancy Reagan's life, then everyone else in that orbit, including the children, would inevitably be measured against that reality. And that is where the family story truly begins. Before Patty Davis publicly rebelled, before Ron Reagan Jr. chose his own path, before the books, the estrangements, and the uneasy reconciliations, there was already a powerful structure in place inside that home. There was a mother shaped by early loneliness, by performance, by discipline, and by a lifelong need to protect the man she had built her world around. To understand the children, one must first understand that. Because the public image of the Reagan family was polished almost to perfection, but behind that polished image was a household organized around loyalty, image, and emotional hierarchy. And once that structure was established, the people growing up inside it had little choice except to either fit into it or struggle against it. From the outside, the Reagan household seemed to offer everything a child could possibly need. There was money, beauty, security, and status. The family lived in Pacific Palisades, one of the most desirable areas in California, and by the standards of public appearance, theirs was a home that suggested comfort and success. Ronald Reagan was already well known, first as an actor, then as a rising political figure. And Nancy Reagan was a woman intensely committed to maintaining order, dignity, and control around him. To the public, they looked like a family blessed by fortune. But households are not defined by appearances alone. They are defined by atmosphere, by emotional patterns, by the things that are said and the things that are not said. And for Nancy Reagan's two children, Patty Davis and Ron Reagan Jr., the reality of growing up inside that home appears to have been far more complicated than the polished image ever suggested. Patty Davis, born Patricia Ann Reagan on October 21st, 1952, entered the world only months after her parents' marriage. In theory, she belonged to a household built around achievement and respectability. In practice, she would later describe a childhood that felt emotionally unsettled and, at times, painfully disconnected. In her own writing, especially in the years when she began speaking publicly about her family, Patty described a home where warmth was inconsistent and where her relationship with her mother was often marked by tension rather than ease. She wrote of feeling as though she did not properly fit within the family at all, as though she were somehow out of step with the emotional rules of the house from the very beginning. Part of the difficulty seems to have been temperamental. Patty was by nature sensitive, questioning, and deeply responsive to emotional undercurrents. Those qualities did not naturally align with the atmosphere of a household where image and discipline were so carefully guarded. She later recalled physical punishment, including being struck with a hairbrush, and described conflicts that, in her view, went beyond ordinary family correction into something harsher and more humiliating. Whether one interprets every memory in exactly the same way is less important than the larger emotional truth she was trying to express. She grew up feeling misunderstood, judged, and fundamentally out of place. That sense of not belonging only deepened as she grew older. As Ronald Reagan's political identity became more visible and more conservative, Patty's instincts began moving in the opposite direction. She was not inclined toward obedience for the sake of appearance, nor did she find it easy to shape herself into the kind of daughter the family image seemed to require. Nancy Reagan, by many accounts, cared deeply about how the family looked to the outside world. She had a clear idea of dignity, behavior, loyalty, and propriety. Patty, almost by instinct, resisted being arranged into that design. One telling sign of that resistance was her name. Rather than fully embracing the Reagan identity, she chose to go by Patty Davis, using her maternal grandmother's maiden name. On the surface, it may have seemed like a small adjustment. In truth, it was something more revealing. Names matter, especially in a family whose surname carried such growing weight. By choosing another name, Patty was already making clear that she needed distance. She was not simply being rebellious. She was trying to define a self that did not feel completely swallowed by the family's public identity. Ron Reagan Jr., born on May 20th, 1958, experienced the same household differently, yet not entirely differently. He has generally spoken about his upbringing in calmer, more measured tones than his sister, but even in his gentler recollections, there is no portrait of an especially intimate or emotionally easy home. He too has suggested that distance was part of the family's atmosphere. The difference was that Ron appeared better able to move within it without openly colliding with it in the way Patty often did. Even so, he was also not naturally made for the role expected of him. As a young man, he developed a serious love for ballet and pursued dance with real dedication. This choice alone quietly set him apart from the more conventional masculine image often associated with his father's public persona. Ronald Reagan, with his Western screen image, political confidence, and traditional style, represented one model of American manhood. Ron Jr. was drawn toward another world entirely, artistic, disciplined, expressive, and less predictable. He later studied at the Joffrey Ballet School in New York, making clear that this was not a passing interest, but a genuine passion. Nancy Reagan reportedly found this more complicated than Ronald did. She worried, as she often did, about appearances and perception. That concern ran through so much of the household's emotional structure. It was not merely about behavior in the abstract. It was about what others would think, what the family represented, and whether each person within it supported or disturbed that image. Both Patty and Ron, in their own ways, grew up needing something their home did not seem naturally built to provide. Patty needed acceptance without constant correction. Ron needed room to become himself, without that self being filtered through image and expectation. What both children seemed to have encountered instead was a family system in which Ronald Reagan stood at the emotional center, Nancy Reagan stood as his vigilant protector, and everyone else adjusted around that arrangement. There were other details that reinforced the feeling of distance. Patty's education, for example, included time away at boarding schools, including the Orm School in Arizona. Such schools were respectable institutions, and many families used them for practical reasons. But for a child already feeling emotionally displaced, being sent away can carry its own message. It can feel less like opportunity and more like removal. Patty later wrote in ways that suggested she experienced it not as reassurance, but as another confirmation that closeness was conditional and belonging uncertain. By the time both children were old enough to form their own identities, the deeper pattern was already fixed. The household looked enviable from a distance, but inside it, there was emotional hierarchy, restraint, and a quiet pressure to conform. Patty reacted by pushing back. Ron reacted by becoming more quietly independent. But both responses grew from the same ground, and that is the crucial thing to understand. The Reagan children were not simply dramatic personalities who later wandered into conflict. They were formed inside a home where appearance mattered enormously, where emotional needs were not always easily met, and where the central fact of family life was that Ronald Reagan remained, in one way or another, the sun around which everyone else revolved. Once that was the structure, tension was almost inevitable. The only question was how and when it would finally break into public view. By the time Ronald Reagan began his presidential campaign in 1980, Patty Davis was no longer a child trying to find her place within the family. She was an adult with her own beliefs, her own relationships, and a growing determination to live outside the boundaries that had been quietly drawn for her since childhood. The problem was not simply that she was different. The problem was that she refused to hide that difference. In many political families, disagreement is handled privately, softened, or carefully managed to avoid public tension. Patty Davis did the opposite. She spoke openly, often directly, and sometimes in ways that made it impossible to ignore the gap between herself and her parents. Her political views leaned in a direction that sharply contrasted with her father's. Where Ronald Reagan was building a conservative movement grounded in strength, patriotism, and traditional values, Patty aligned herself with more progressive causes, particularly on issues like nuclear disarmament and social policy. This was not a quiet disagreement. It unfolded publicly, at rallies, in interviews, and in the spaces where the media could not help but notice. Patty attended anti-nuclear demonstrations and voiced criticism of positions that were closely tied to her father's presidency. In doing so, she became something unusual, the daughter of a sitting president who openly challenged the very ideas that had helped put him in office. Inside the family, this created strain that went far beyond politics. For Nancy Reagan, criticism of her husband was never just political disagreement. It was personal. Her identity had long been intertwined with his success, his reputation, and his protection. To see her own daughter publicly oppose him was not simply disappointing, it was deeply unsettling. The relationship between mother and daughter, already fragile from years of emotional distance, began to fracture in ways that were impossible to ignore. There were long periods when they barely spoke. This silence was not symbolic. It was real and lived. There were missed calls, strained encounters, and moments when the absence of connection was as visible as any argument could have been. At the same time, Patty was building a life that moved further and further away from the expectations attached to the Reagan name. She pursued writing and acting, lived independently in Los Angeles, and formed relationships that did not fit neatly within the image her family projected. One of those relationships, with Bernie Leadon of the Eagles, drew attention of its own, adding another layer to the sense that Patty was living on a path entirely separate from the one envisioned for her. But perhaps the most important thing about this period is not the specific choices she made, but the pattern behind them. Patty was not simply rebelling for the sake of rebellion. She was asserting control over her identity in a way that felt necessary to her. Having grown up in a household where image carried enormous weight, she seemed determined to reject that control entirely. If the family required quiet conformity, she would choose visible independence. If the expectation was loyalty expressed through silence, she would choose honesty, even when it created conflict. This approach came with consequences. Within the White House orbit, Patty became a complicated figure. Some saw her as an embarrassment, a disruption to the carefully maintained narrative of unity. Others found her fascinating, even admirable, precisely because she refused to play the expected role. She was, in many ways, both things at once, a source of discomfort for her family and a symbol of independence for those watching from the outside. There were moments that highlighted this divide with particular clarity. Public events where presidential families typically appeared together often took place without her. Invitations were declined. Appearances were brief. The absence itself became a kind of presence, a quiet but unmistakable signal that something within the family was not as seamless as it appeared. And then came a decision that pushed the tension into an entirely different space. In 1994, Patti Davis posed for Playboy magazine. The photographs, once published, sparked immediate reaction. For many observers, it seemed shocking. For Nancy Reagan, it was deeply painful. This was not simply about public perception, though that mattered greatly in a family so attuned to image. It was about the feeling that a boundary had been crossed in a way that could not easily be repaired. To understand that moment fully, it is necessary to see it from both sides. From Patti's perspective, the decision was tied to autonomy, a way of taking control of how she was seen, of refusing to be defined by expectations she had never accepted. From Nancy's perspective, it represented a public unraveling of something she had spent decades trying to build and protect. Between those two perspectives lay a gap that neither could easily bridge. By the mid-1990s, the relationship between Patti and her mother had reached what many would have considered its lowest point. They were not simply distant. They were separated by years of unresolved hurt, conflicting values, and choices that had been made in full public view. And yet, even at that distance, something remained. Not closeness, not understanding, but a connection that had not entirely disappeared. Because what was unfolding between them was not a simple story of rebellion or rejection. It was something more complicated. It was the story of a daughter who refused to be shaped by a system that did not fit her, and a mother who had built her life around a structure that left little room for that kind of refusal. And the consequences of that conflict were not finished yet. The most difficult chapter, the one that would expose the private reality of the family in the most direct way, was still to come. By the mid-1980s, the distance between Patti Davis and her family was no longer something that existed quietly behind closed doors. It had already become visible through her public positions and personal choices. But what came next did something far more serious. It did not just reveal tension, it documented it, fixed it in words, and placed it directly into the public record. In 1986, Patti published a novel titled Home Front. It was presented as fiction, but to many readers, the parallels were unmistakable. The story centered on a powerful political family, a distant father, a controlling mother, and a daughter struggling to find her place within that structure. Even without explicit confirmation, it was widely understood as a reflection of her own experiences. For the Reagan family, this was uncomfortable, but it was still, at least technically, fiction, something that allowed a small layer of distance between reality and narrative. That distance disappeared completely in 1992. That year, Patti Davis released her memoir, The Way I See It. Unlike the earlier novel, this book did not rely on suggestion or interpretation. It was direct. It was personal. And it described her childhood and family life with a level of detail that made it impossible to dismiss or soften. She wrote about emotional distance inside the home. She wrote about discipline that felt harsh and humiliating. She described feeling invisible, out of place, and disconnected from both her parents. She spoke openly about her struggles in early adulthood, including substance use, and about relationships that had been damaging to her. The tone of the book was not theatrical. It was controlled, reflective, and, in many ways, deeply unsettling because of its honesty. For Nancy Reagan, reading those pages was, by most accounts, profoundly painful. It is important to understand the timing. By the early 1990s, Ronald Reagan had already left the presidency, widely admired and celebrated. His legacy was being shaped, preserved, and strengthened in the public imagination. The image of the Reagan family, disciplined, loyal, so united, was a significant part of that legacy. Patty's memoir disrupted that image completely. It did not matter to many readers whether every detail was perfectly accurate. What mattered was that the president's own daughter was describing a family life that did not match the public picture. She was saying, in calm and unmistakable language, that behind the speeches and ceremonies there had been distance, conflict, and pain. The reaction was immediate. Within the Reagan family, there was strong resistance to what Patty had written. Some of her siblings disagreed publicly with her account, suggesting that her portrayal did not reflect their own experiences. Nancy, through those close to her, made it clear that she found the book deeply unfair. The sense of betrayal was not only about the content, it was about the fact that it had been shared with the world. For Nancy Reagan, who had spent decades carefully managing how the family was seen, this was more than criticism. It was exposure. Private memories, private conflicts, and private wounds had been turned into a public narrative that could not be taken back. For Patty, however, the book represented something else entirely. It was, in her own view, an act of honesty, a way of telling her story on her own terms after years of feeling silenced or misunderstood. She did not retreat from what she had written. She stood by it, even as it deepened the divide between her and her family. And the divide became absolute. During this period, Patty and her mother were not speaking. They were not sharing space, not repairing anything, not moving toward understanding. The estrangement was complete enough that it became part of the public conversation surrounding the Reagan family. People knew there was distance, and not the kind that could be dismissed as a temporary disagreement. What made it difficult to watch, even from the outside, was how familiar it felt at a human level. Beneath the political context, beneath the public attention, this was a story of a mother and daughter who had hurt each other in ways that neither fully knew how to repair. One had spoken publicly about her pain. The other felt that speaking itself had caused a new kind of wound. And yet, even this was not the final breaking point. Because alongside the emotional distance and public conflict, something else was beginning to unfold. Something that would change the direction of the entire family's story in a way no argument ever could. In November 1994, a letter was written to the American people. It was not a political announcement. It was something far more personal. And once that letter was made public, the conflicts that had defined the Reagan family for years would begin, slowly and unexpectedly, to shift into something else. In November 1994, Ronald Reagan released a handwritten letter to the American people. It was calm, measured, and unmistakably personal. In it, he announced that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The tone was gracious, almost gentle, as he thanked the country and spoke of beginning a new chapter, one that would take him away from public life. For the world, it was a moment of sympathy and reflection. For the Reagan family, it changed everything. Alzheimer's is not a sudden loss. It is gradual, relentless, and deeply unsettling in the way it unfolds. It takes memory first, then recognition, then the small, ordinary connections that define daily life. Over time, it reshapes relationships in ways that are difficult to describe, because the person is still physically present, even as parts of them begin to disappear. For Nancy Reagan, this diagnosis marked the beginning of a decade that would define the rest of her life. She had always been devoted to her husband, but now that devotion took on a different form. It was no longer about supporting a political career or maintaining a public image. It became something quieter and far more demanding, the work of care, day after day, as the man she had built her life around slowly changed. She stayed close to him, often rarely leaving his side. She became his advocate in the public sphere, speaking about the disease and supporting research, even when it placed her at odds with political allies she had once stood beside. But much of what she carried during those years happened away from public view. The long hours, the repetition, the gradual realization that recognition might fade. These were not things easily displayed or explained. For Patty Davis, this period introduced something unexpected. The years before had been marked by distance, anger, and a sense that the relationship with her mother might never be repaired. But illness has a way of shifting perspective. It does not erase the past, but it changes the weight of it. When someone you love begins to disappear in this slow and uncertain way, the questions that once seemed urgent can begin to feel different. Patty began visiting more frequently. The encounters between her and her mother were not instantly warm or effortless. They did not suddenly become the kind of relationship neither of them had ever truly had, but something changed in the tone. They were able to sit in the same room without the same immediate tension. Conversations, even small ones, became possible again. There was still history between them, years of it, but now there was also a shared reality that neither could ignore. Watching her father's condition also affected how Patty saw her mother. For much of her life, she had experienced Nancy primarily as a figure of control and distance. But now she saw something else as well. A woman carrying a particular kind of grief, one that unfolds slowly and without clear resolution. Alzheimer's does not offer a single moment of loss. It creates many small ones, spread over years. Each forgotten name, each missed recognition, each quiet change becomes part of the experience. Nancy remained devoted through all of it. She would sit with Ronald, hold his hand, to speak to him, even when his ability to respond had diminished. The public did not always see this side of her. The polished image that had defined her for so long did not fully capture the reality of those private years. What remained was something simpler and more human. Persistence, loyalty, and the quiet endurance of watching someone fade. For Patty, witnessing this seemed to add a new dimension to her understanding. It did not undo the past. It did not erase the memories she had written about or the conflicts that had shaped their relationship. But it made space for something else. A recognition that her mother, too, had been shaped by her own fears, attachments, and losses. Their relationship, during these years, moved slowly towards something that might be called reconciliation, though it was not perfect or complete. It was tentative, uneven, but real. They found ways to share time, to exist in the same space without reopening every old wound. In families, that kind of progress can be as meaningful as anything more dramatic. Ronald Reagan lived for nearly a decade after his diagnosis. Over those years, the illness continued its course. The man who had once commanded attention with ease gradually withdrew into a quieter, more limited world. On June 5, 2004, he passed away at the age of 93. His death marked the end of something that had defined Nancy Reagan's life for more than 50 years. For the first time in her adult life, she was no longer organizing everything around her husband's presence. The structure that had shaped her identity, as protector, partner, and constant companion, was gone. What remained was a different kind of silence, one she had never truly experienced before. And in that silence, her relationship with her children took on a new importance. The years of conflict had not disappeared, but they were no longer the only thing that defined those relationships. Patty was there more often. Ron Jr. remained part of her life as well. The family, which had once seemed so divided, began to exist again in a more shared space. Not perfectly united, but no longer completely fractured. What is striking about this period is not that everything was resolved. It was not. The past remained complicated, as it often does. But something had shifted. The illness had changed the center of the family. Where once everything revolved around image, expectation, and public life, it now revolved around care, loss, and the quiet recognition of what truly remained when everything else fell away. And in that shift, space opened for something that had once seemed unlikely, a form of understanding that did not require agreement, and a closeness that did not depend on perfection. The final chapter of their story would not be about conflict. It would be about what remained after it. After the death of Ronald Reagan in 2004, the story of the Reagan family did not end. It changed shape. The public chapter, defined by power, politics, and global attention, had closed. What remained was quieter, more personal, and in many ways more revealing than anything that had come before. Nancy Reagan lived for another 12 years after her husband's passing. Those years were marked by a gradual withdrawal from public life. The woman who had once stood at the center of one of the most visible political partnerships in modern American history became increasingly private. She was still respected, still recognized, but she was no longer performing the role that had defined her for so long. People who saw her during those later years often described a change that was difficult to put into simple terms. She was still sharp in many ways, still aware, still composed. But there was also a softness that had not always been visible before. The intensity that had once been directed outward, toward protecting her husband, managing his image, defending his legacy, seemed to have turned inward. In that space, her relationship with her children became something she appeared to value more openly. With Patty Davis, the relationship had already begun to shift during Ronald Reagan's illness. In the years that followed his death, that shift continued. They spent time together more regularly. They shared quieter moments, evenings, conversations, ordinary routines that had once seemed impossible between them. It was not a perfect reconciliation. The past did not disappear, and neither of them pretended that it had. But there was a kind of balance that had not existed before. Patty later wrote about those years with a tone that was noticeably different from her earlier work. The anger that had once defined much of her public voice had softened into something more reflective. She did not erase the difficulties of her childhood or the pain of her earlier relationship with her mother. Instead, she began to describe Nancy with more complexity, as someone shaped by her own history, her own fears, and her own emotional patterns. There is something significant in that shift. It suggests not forgiveness in a simple sense, but understanding. Patty seemed to recognize that her mother's behavior had not existed in isolation. It had roots. In her early life, in her need for stability, in the way she had built her identity around one central relationship. That recognition did not undo the past, but it allowed Patty to see it differently. At the same time, Patty's own life had begun to settle into something more stable. She continued writing novels, essays, personal reflections, and her work became less about confrontation and more about exploration. She spoke openly about her struggles with substance use, about her experiences with family, and about what it meant to grow older with those memories still present but no longer overwhelming. She also became an advocate for Alzheimer's awareness, drawing on what she had witnessed during her father's illness. That experience, sitting with him, staying even when he could no longer recognize her, became one of the defining emotional threads of her later life. It reflected a kind of love that exists beyond recognition, beyond memory, rooted simply in connection. Ron Reagan Jr. followed a different path, but one that led to a similar kind of resolution. He built a career in journalism and political commentary, remaining consistently open about his views, even when they diverged sharply from his father's legacy. He spoke about Ronald Reagan with both admiration and criticism, refusing to simplify his perspective into something easier or more acceptable. That balance, holding both respect and disagreement at the same time, became one of the defining features of his public identity. He also maintained a stable personal life, particularly through his long marriage to Doria Palmieri. In contrast to the turbulence that had marked earlier periods of the family's history, his life seemed to move with a steadier rhythm. He did not attempt to escape the Reagan name, but neither did he allow it to define him entirely. With Nancy, his relationship remained intact, though not without its complexities. There were disagreements, particularly over how Ronald Reagan's legacy should be understood and remembered. But unlike the earlier years of complete estrangement seen with Patty, the connection between Ron Jr. and his mother held. It adapted, shifted, and continued. When Nancy Reagan died on March 6, 2016, at the age of 94, she was not alone. She was surrounded by people who loved her, not in a perfect or uncomplicated way, but in the only way that truly exists within families, a mixture of memory, history, understanding, and acceptance. Patty was there. Ron Jr. was there. The relationships that had once seemed fractured beyond repair had found a way to exist again, not flawlessly, not completely healed, but real. And that is perhaps the most important part of this story. The Reagan family will always be remembered for its public image, for the presidency, the speeches, the carefully constructed picture of unity and strength. That image is not false. It reflects something genuine about who Ronald and Nancy Reagan were and what they built together. But it is not the whole story.